Hello everyone, welcome to the Riley Lewis Show. I am your host, Riley Lewis. We cut 3, 2, 1. Hello everyone, welcome to the Riley Lewis Show. I am your host, Riley Lewis. We have an interesting episode today. Of course, like always, as usual, you should expect interesting content from me, including today's episode, which actually features a resignation at the New York Times over the new cancel culture wars. You see, I'm taking that term cancel culture and culture wars and really just fusing them because this is really what this is about. It's the culture of reform-minded, progressive, even traditionally progressive people, historical progressives like Bari Weiss, who just left the New York Times, who was hired for her progressive viewpoint, who could also bridge across the aisle and speak with conservatives. But there's no more room for that left. It's complete cancel culture wars, and, well, she wasn't, I guess, technically canceled, but she points out some very interesting things in her resignation letter. Again, this is Bari Weiss. She was hired by the New York Times, I believe, in 2016, just following the election of Donald Trump, and she's someone who is, definitely, I would say after seeing her interviewed, a progressive on most things and really to the left on most issues. However, she's reasonable and she's open-minded and she's not interested in labeling people, public shaming, and she's certainly not interested in what's going on at the New York Times, the complete buffoonery that they call journalism over there. So, that said, let's just start by reading this letter again from journalist Bari Weiss. The letter begins, "Dear AG, it is with sadness that I write to tell you that I am resigning from the New York Times. I joined the paper with gratitude and optimism 3 years ago. I was hired with the goal of bringing in voices that would not otherwise appear in your pages. First-time writers, centrists, conservatives, and others who would not naturally think of the Times as their home. The reason for this effort was clear. The paper's failure to anticipate the outcome of the 2016 election meant that it did not have a firm grasp of the country it covers. Absolutely true. That is entirely correct. Dean Banquet, one of the editors at the New York Times, and others have admitted as much on various occasions. The priority, in opinion, was to help redress that critical shortcoming. I was honored to be a part of that effort, led by James Bennett. I am proud of my work as a writer and as an editor. Among those I helped bring to our pages, the Venezuelan dissident Willy Ortega, I'm sure I did not pronounce that correctly, the Iranian chess champion Dorsa Dirakhshani, and the Hong Kong Christian Democrat Derek Lam. Also, and there's a long list of names here that I won't totally read, but Maddie Friedman, Nick Gillespie, Heather Haying, who I actually believe now works a lot with Brett Weinstein on his Dark Horse podcast, Chloe Valdery, Thomas Chatterton Williams, who signed that letter that just came out on Justice and Open Debate, along with 153 others, Wesley Yang, and many other people. Back to the letter. Quote, "But the lessons that ought to have followed the election, lessons about the importance of understanding other Americans, the necessity of resisting tribalism, and the centrality of the free exchange of ideas to a democratic society have not been learned. Instead, a new consensus has emerged in the press, but perhaps especially at this paper. That truth isn't a process of collective discovery, but an orthodoxy already known to an enlightened few whose job is to inform everyone else." And that is the sort of moral superiority buffoonery that we see in the mainstream media. I'll read that sentence again. Truth isn't a process of collective discovery for this paper. Instead, truth is an orthodoxy that is already known to an enlightened few whose job is to inform everyone else. In other words, there are a few people who determine what will be said regardless of what the truth is, and their job is to make sure that everybody goes along with the mainstream dogma and that nobody dissents. And that's why Bari Weiss I mean, the Times literally drove her away. This is an incredibly talented journalist who's been interviewed by Joe Rogan. She's brilliant, and she's been driven away by the buffoonery and the tomfoolery and the madness that is now the New York Times. Back to her letter. Quote, "Twitter is not on the masthead of the New York Times. But Twitter has become its ultimate editor." So true. As the ethics and mores of that platform have become those of the paper itself has increasingly become a kind of performance space. Stories are chosen and told in a way to satisfy the narrowest of audiences, rather than to allow a curious public to read about the world and then draw on their own conclusions. I was always taught that journalists were charged with writing the first rough draft of history. Now, history itself is one more ephemeral thing molded to fit the needs of a predetermined narrative. And this is absolutely correct. She is absolutely correct. If you want to succeed in legacy media and mainstream news, you stick to the talking points. You ignore truth, you ignore common sense, you ignore integrity, you parrot the talking points. You receive the email, you read the talking points, and that's what you parrot. And that's really what Bari Weiss is protesting with this resignation. And, she also provides a lot of insight by noting that the paper itself, the New York Times, along with many other papers, aren't really about journalism anymore. They're about some sort of a performance. And this is really what drives people like me crazy, because journalism should be about journalism and performance should be about performance. But this is what happens when you live in a world where journalists are not journalists, but instead activists putting on a performance disguised as journalists. This is a Trojan horse operation, if you will. Back to her letter, quote, "My own forays into wrongthink have made me the subject of constant bullying by colleagues who disagree with my views." I should mention, by the way, I believe Bari Weiss is Jewish, so that's important to understand going into this next sentence. "They have called me a Nazi and a racist," which, by the way, first of all, no one ever seems to talk about anti-Semitism in the news, including when Deshaun Jackson recently was retweeting things, that were allegedly tied to Hitler. So and you're not hearing that in the news at all. And meanwhile, we have people like Ben Shapiro, who's an Orthodox Jewish person, and also Bari Weiss, who's a Jewish person, both being called Nazis because people disagree with their views. That's the peak absurdity that we've hit. Jewish people getting called Nazis. That's peak lunacy. We're there. We are in crazy town. Population everybody at the New York Times. We are there. "They've called me a Nazi and a racist. I have learned to brush off comments about how I'm writing about the Jews again." Wow, just despicable that someone would just demean her like that, belittle her like that. Quote, "Several colleagues perceived to be friendly with me were badgered by coworkers. My work and my character are openly demeaned on company-wide Slack channels where masthead editors regularly weigh in. There, some coworkers insist I need to be rooted out of this company. Some coworkers insist I need to be rooted out if this company is to be a truly inclusive one. So we need to root out toleration and substitute our intolerant attitudes in order to be truly inclusive." Again, peak lunacy. This is just peak lunacy. So again, referring to these company-wide Slack channels, some coworkers insist I need to be rooted out if this company is to be a truly inclusive one, while others post axe emojis next to my name. Still, other New York Times employees publicly smear me as a liar and a bigot on Twitter, with no fear that harassing me will be met with appropriate action. They never are. Right, because journalists these days never have to take any consequences for their actions. That's why they keep doing what they do. There are terms for all of this: unlawful discrimination, hostile work environment, and constructive discharge. I'm no legal expert, but I know that this is wrong. I do not understand how you have allowed this kind of behavior to go on inside your company in full view of the paper's entire staff and the public. And I certainly can't square how you and other Times leaders have stood by while simultaneously praising me in private for any courage. That is the peak lunacy. That's the peak lunacy, again, we are living in. This is lunar madness. We have people who have to secretly say, "Bari Weiss, I think you're doing a good job," or secretly, "Happy birthday, Ben Shapiro," because they're afraid that the piranhas in their own party will eat them alive if they dare humanize someone that does not subscribe to their dogma. This is not politics anymore. This is Puritanism. This isn't even politics anymore. This is a Puritan, quasi-Marxist takeover. And if Bari Weiss doesn't subscribe to the struggle sessions, then they berate her and chide her publicly on company-wide Slack channels, and that's okay? Calling a Jewish person a Nazi isn't fireable? This is ridiculous. I hope that you're also outraged because this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. I think the people at the New York Times should be ashamed of themselves. They should be ashamed of themselves, truly, for allowing this kind of rhetoric to go on, these extremist narratives that result in Jewish people getting called Nazis. How ignorant and offensive is that? This is just ridiculous, but at this point, I don't expect any better from people at the New York Times. I really don't. You guys have time and again proven yourselves and shown us your true colors. So nice job, New York Times. Really, nice job. Nice work. Well done, truly. Now, going back to this letter. I do not understand, again, right, I do not understand how you have allowed this kind of behavior to go on inside your company in full view of the paper's entire staff and the public. And I certainly can't square how you and other Times leaders have stood by while simultaneously praising me in private for my courage. Showing up for work as a centrist at an American newspaper should not require bravery. So true. Showing up in a news organization as a free thinker should not require bravery in a democracy. Part of me wishes I could, back to this letter, part of me wishes I could say that my experience was unique. But the truth is that intellectual curiosity, let alone risk-taking, is now a liability at the Times. Why edit something challenging to our readers, or write something bold only to go through the numbing process of making it ideologically kosher, when we can assure ourselves of job security by publishing our 4,000th op-ed arguing that Donald Trump is a unique danger to the country and the world? And so self-censorship has become the norm. That's right, self-censoring and censorship has become the norm. What rules that remain at the Times are applied with extreme selectivity? If a person's ideology is in keeping with the new orthodoxy, they and their work remain unscrutinized, which, by the way, is, again, pitiful because one of the pillars of journalism, you can Google this online, is disciplined research. So the fact that their work goes unscrutinized if people generally agree with their politics is shameful of journalism, truly. And this really, to me, is largely why our conversations aren't productive, because our journalists aren't productive. They're not actually producing journalism, they're producing propaganda that's ideologically kosher, according to the select few at the New York Times. Back to this letter, quote, "Everyone else lives in fear of the digital thunderdome. Online venom is excused so long as it is directed at the proper targets. Op-eds that would have easily been published just 2 years ago would now get an editor or a writer in serious trouble if not fired. If a piece is perceived as likely to inspire backlash internally or on social media, the editor or writer avoids pitching it. If she feels strongly enough to suggest it, she is quickly steered to safer ground. And if, every now and then, she succeeds in getting a piece published that does not explicitly promote progressive causes, it happens only after every line is carefully massaged, negotiated, and caveated." Right, absolutely. You'll see things, even in that one letter where they wanted to say, hey, we want freedom of speech, and you guys are threatening it. They basically put an asterisk in that letter next to that by saying, we see this from right-wing demagogues. And these imaginary right-wing demagogues are how they're able to sort of, massage the ideological, desire or, the dogma, if you will. That's how they stay inside the lines. They want to speak the truth, but then they have to follow it with propaganda. A little bit of truth, a little bit of propaganda. That way you don't tip the equilibrium. That's what's important. You can't tip the equilibrium. You can't say too much truth because, that reality business is bad for our business and their business, right? So now back to the paper again. It took the paper 2 days and 2 jobs to say that the Tom Cotton op-ed, quote, fell short of our standards. We attached an editor's note on a travel story about Jaffa shortly after it was published because it, quote, failed to touch on important aspects of Jaffa's makeup and its history. But there was still none appended to Cheryl Strayed's fawning interview with the writer Alice Walker, a proud anti-Semite who believes in the lizard Illuminati. The paper of record, referring to the New York Times, is, more and more, the record of those living in a distant galaxy, one whose concerns are profoundly removed from the lives of most people. This is a galaxy in which, to choose just a few recent examples, the Soviet space program is lauded for its diversity. The doxing of teenagers in the name of justice is condoned, which we've seen on Twitter countless times, and the worst caste systems in human history includes the United States along Nazi Germany, which is obviously incredibly preposterous. And that's her point. Even now, I am confident that most people at the Times do not hold these views. Yet they are cowed by those who do. Why? Perhaps because they believe the ultimate goal is righteous. Perhaps because they believe that they will be granted protection if they nod along as the coin of our realm, language, is degraded in service to an ever-shifting laundry list of right causes. Perhaps because there are millions of unemployed people in this country and they feel lucky to have a job in a contracting industry. That's a good point. Or perhaps it is because they know that, nowadays, standing up for principle at the paper does not win plaudits. It puts a target on your back. Too wise to post on Slack, they write to me privately about the new McCarthyism that has taken root at the paper of record. And that's what this is, the new era of McCarthyism. All this bodes ill, especially for independent-minded young writers and editors paying close attention to what they'll have to do to advance their careers. Rule 1. Speak your mind at your own peril. True. Rule 2. Never risk commissioning a story that goes against the narrative. Also true. Rule 3. Never believe an editor or publisher who urges you to go against the grain. Eventually, the publisher will cave to the mob, the editor will get fired or reassigned, and you'll be hung out to dry. So true. So, in other words, stay inside the lines. You're not allowed to have your own thoughts. No way, no how. For these young writers and editors, there is one consolation. As places like the Times and other once great journalistic institutions betray their standards and lose sight of their principles, Americans still hunger for news that is accurate, opinions that are vital, and debate that is sincere. I hear from these people every day. An independent press is not a liberal ideal or progressive ideal or a democratic ideal. It's an American ideal. You said a few years ago. I couldn't agree more. America is a great country that deserves a great newspaper. None of this means that some of the most talented journalists in the world don't still labor for this newspaper. They do, and to her credit, there are still good people at the New York Times. Which is what makes the illiberal environment especially heartbreaking. Right, because they're tolerating this new McCarthyism. I will be, as ever, a dedicated reader of their work. But I can no longer do the work that you brought me here to do. The work that Adolph Oakes described in the famous 1896 statement, quote, to make of the columns of the New York Times a forum for the consideration of all questions of public importance. And to that end, to invite intelligent discussion from all shades of opinion. Oakes' idea is one of the best I've ever encountered, and I've always comforted myself with the notion that the best ideas win out. But ideas cannot win on their own, and she's right, by the way. They need a voice. They need a hearing. Above all, they must be backed by people willing to live by them. Sincerely, Bari. Wow. That was an incredibly powerful letter from someone who's spent the last 3 to 4 years working at the New York Times, and this is, again, not some right-winger. This is a progressive Jewish young lady who's independent-minded and wanted to write something other than the fact that Donald Trump is responsible for the apocalypse for the 1,000,000th time, and the New York Times is not interested in hearing anything else besides the Orange Man is responsible for the apocalypse. So it's really sad to watch the pillars of journalism be abandoned by the American and global paper of record, but that's the world that we're living in now. This is the new era of McCarthyism. the new era of McCarthyism where 6 different pediatricians go on MSNBC and say they're eager to send their kids back to school, but you can't find the clip online because it goes against the mainstream dogma, so they're not going to put it on YouTube. Why would they? It goes against the predetermined narrative that comes from a few enlightened people at the stages of the new McCarthy pyramid, at the top tiers of the new McCarthyism pyramid. That said, thank you everybody for listening to today's episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I appreciate your time as always. I hope you learned something. I hope you felt something. If you want to read this letter online, again, this is Bari Weiss. She formerly wrote for the New York Times, and this is her resignation letter. It is available on her website. I'm actually glad to hear that she will still read the Times, but is able to no longer work for the Times, so it's nice to see that she's mature about this. She's mature enough to realize that she doesn't want to support it by writing for them and prop up that propaganda, but she will read them to understand where they're going, and because obviously she feels something. She's worked there for years and written a lot for them, and she's really an excellent writer. So I think it's important that people know about what's going on here, because this is really just following the letter we just had that was signed again by Noam Chomsky, by J.K. Rowling, by Margaret Atwood, by Malcolm Gladwell, and 150 other people total, that was basically saying the same thing, using the exact same language about the same institutions. Our journalistic institutions are falling apart at the seams, like many other of our institutions. And journalism, free thought, free speech, and open debate are all things that are important in a democracy. And just like that letter said, I want to reiterate that justice and freedom cannot exist without each other. There should be no dichotomy between justice and freedom, because they cannot exist without each other. So I hope that everybody heard Bari Weiss loud and clear. I know that there are going to be a lot of people that are likely going to criticize this letter and criticize her, but according to her words here, maybe secretly praise her, which is just so sad to me. If you want to talk about a fragile state and what a fragile state looks like, a fragile state, the rhetoric in a fragile state would be very, the rhetoric that we are seeing in the United States today, the sort of rhetoric and language and behavior that would result in Jewish writers like Bari Weiss and Ben Shapiro getting labeled Nazis is completely emblematic of how fragile our state is. There is a complete lack of self-awareness that is being coupled by peak lunacy, and that formula results in Jewish writers who are free-minded, who don't bow down, getting called Nazis. So this is the world we're living in, everybody. The New York Times made this bed, and we have to lie in it. Again, thank you everybody for listening to today's episode of The Riley Lewis Show. I hope to see you here again tomorrow. If you'd like to support me, you can hit that subscribe button down below. You'll also find the link right here to my playlist for my daily politics podcast. You can also find me on Anchor.fm, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Apple Podcasts. You can also donate to my Patreon account. You'll find the link in the description of this video, or you can donate to my virtual wallet on Anchor.fm. In any case, I appreciate your time. Thank you for listening to The Riley Lewis Show.